So, Washington issued a mandate, a 100% tariff threat, a total blockade of the northern border. The District of Columbia assumed they held the only exit. They believed Canada was a captured asset with zero options. They were entirely wrong. Mark Carney did not fly to Washington to beg for a diplomatic exemption. He did not issue a public performance of grievance. He did not engage in the standard theater of North American negotiation. He flew to Beijing. He finalized a comprehensive trade agreement, not a minor adjustment, not a policy tweak, a fundamental structural realignment of the continent's economic flow. 100% down to 6%. That is the new tariff rate for Chinese electric vehicles entering Canada. A backdoor into the North American market was just kicked wide open. Not a negotiation, a command of the physical market. Washington attempted to utilize economic coercion as a cage. Carney used it as a catalyst. Hit subscribe. Because what happened next is the exact moment the world's largest economy discovered a brutal physical reality. Its 100% tariff threat did not build a wall. It built a bridge for its greatest strategic competitor. Power means nothing when your opponent owns the door. That is the narrative. Here is the math. Let us project the baseline reality. Let us examine the profound knowledge failure currently paralyzing the strategic establishment in Washington. For decades, the assumption in the American capital has been absolute. Canada is a satellite economy. 75% of Canadian exports move south. That dependency was viewed as a permanent leash, a geopolitical chain that could be yanked whenever Washington required a concession. The District of Columbia believed they possessed the ultimate veto over Ottawa's external trade. They assumed that because Canada needed access to the American consumer, Canada would accept any degree of regulatory pressure. This is the arrogance of a legacy power, a total failure of perception, a systemic knowledge failure. Washington treated the relationship as a fixed asset. No depreciation, no risk, infinite compliance. They believed they could weaponize trade without consequence. They assumed that a 100% tariff was a win-lose scenario, where Washington always held the winning hand. They ignored the math. They ignored the map. They ignored the auditor. But here is what the headlines completely missed. Physics doesn't negotiate, and markets abhor a vacuum. When you raise the cost of a transaction to 100%, you do not preserve your market dominance. You delete it. You do not create a submissive partner. You create a desperate competitor. You force your partner to run a comprehensive risk assessment of your reliability. You force them to find a new vendor. You trigger an immediate, well-capitalized bypass. Washington forgot the first rule of global trade. You only control the customer if the customer has no other choice. Canada has choices. Beijing is a choice. Brussels is a choice. The Indo-Pacific is a choice. By utilizing strategic confrontation as a primary tool, Washington didn't prove its strength. It proved its unreliability. It demonstrated to every boardroom in Canada that the United States is no longer a stable anchor. It is a volatile variable. This was not a policy disagreement. This was a catastrophic mispricing of risk. The administration in the United States looked at the spreadsheets and saw a trade deficit. Mark Carney looked at the global ledger and saw a concentration risk. He realized the 75% dependency on a volatile neighbor is a terminal liability. It is a single point of failure. It is an operational vulnerability that must be diversified at any cost. So he liquidated the position, he moved the assets, he opened the northern door to the highest bidder. Washington thought they were selling excess. Carney realized they were selling instability. He didn't blink, he didn't hesitate, he didn't wait for permission. He recognized that you cannot tariff geography and you cannot sanction a nation that has already found a more reliable customer. Not an oversight, not a minor miscalculation, a profound systemic knowledge failure. Washington fundamentally mispriced the physical reality of North American integration, and the market of global geopolitics is currently preparing a massive, irreversible correction. The dealer thought he held the leash. The auditor realized he held the key to the cage. Canada is not waiting for a signature from Washington. They are building a wall, not of concrete, but of steel, sensors, and sovereign presence. This is the sovereign chokehold. Chapter 1. The $40 billion iron wall. This is not a theoretical investment. This is the physical price of independence. For decades, the Arctic was a neglected frontier and frozen wasteland that Canada allowed the United States to monitor through NORAD. The assumption was simple. American technology would provide the eyes. American power would provide the muscle. Canada would provide the space. That era is dead. Mark Carney just issued a $40 billion eviction notice to American strategic complacency. This investment targets 40% of Canada's landmass. It targets 75% of its coastline. It is designed for one purpose: absolute control. 365 days a year. Land, sea, air, in Yellowknife, in the high Arctic, across every maritime corridor. Canada is building the infrastructure to project power independently, not as a subset of American defense. As a sovereign master of the High North, Washington ignored the physical requirements of Arctic dominance. They focused on the performance of the deal. They focused on the optics of threats. They forgot that you cannot control what you do not occupy. Carney is occupying the space. Every dollar of this $40 billion fund is a replacement cost for American dependency. Every new Canadian port is a gateway that Washington no longer manages. Every surveillance satellite launched by Ottawa is an eye that does not report to the Pentagon first. This is not a partnership. It is a decoupling of the North American security loop. Washington thought they were the only ones who could protect the roof. They realized they are the ones the roof is being reinforced against. Then comes Chapter 2, the EU Bridge. This is the geographic reality that Washington completely missed. Look at the map again. Not the one in the Oval Office, the physical one. Canada shares a 3,000-kilometer border with the European Union. How? Through Greenland. By standing with Denmark, Carney is not just defending a NATO ally, he is securing a direct gateway to Berlin and Oslo. He is integrating the North into the European security architecture. Standing in Oslo, Carney wasn't just talking to reporters, he was finalizing an Arctic monopoly, a coalition of democratic middle powers: Canada, Germany, Norway, the Nordic states, the Baltic Gateway. This is a unified bloc that controls the literal physical access to the future of global trade. Washington has been downgraded. They are no longer the host of the Arctic conversation, they are a guest who is increasingly unwelcome. The message from the Oslo summit was unmistakable. The United States is welcome to participate, but the alliance will function whether Washington chooses to lead or not. Canada has found a new set of partners. Partners who respect sovereignty. Partners who follow the rules. Partners who do not treat allies as real estate opportunities. This leads us to Chapter 3, the scramble for critical minerals. This is the part Washington didn't plan for. Donald Trump's obsession with Greenland was not a joke. It was a recognition of an inelastic input. Beneath the ice lies the largest untapped deposit of critical minerals in the world: lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, the absolute requirements for the American technology sector, the lifeblood of the military-industrial complex. Washington thought they could acquire these resources through coercion. They thought they could Greenland the territory. They failed. Mark Carney moved first by committing $40 billion to Arctic security and economic infrastructure. Canada has effectively parked its tanks on the lawn of the world's most valuable mineral bank. Canada is now the guardian of the inputs the United States cannot live without. If you want the lithium for your batteries, you go through Ottawa. If you want the cobalt for your missiles, you go through the Nordic Canadian Gateway. If you want the rare earth elements for your advanced electronics, you respect Canadian sovereignty. This is the ultimate ironic effect. Washington's threats to scoop up resources did not secure the supply. It triggered a defensive alliance that has now locked the vault. Canada is now coordinating its mineral policy with the European Union. They are building alternative supply chains that deliberately bypass American middlemen. They are finding partners in Tokyo and Seoul. They are creating a world where the American manufacturer is the last person in line. Washington thought they could bully their way into a resource boom. They ended up in an operational famine. The audit reveals a total collapse of American leverage in the high north. You cannot threaten a nation that holds your energy. You cannot coerce a partner who manages your airspace. And you absolutely cannot intimidate an ally who controls your raw materials. The scramble is over. The iron wall is up. The EU bridge is open, and the minerals are being redirected. Washington is left holding a checkbook that no one wants to see. They are shouting at the ice while Canada is mining the future. Read that again. Geography doesn't need an alliance. It needs a presence. Canada is present. Washington is performative. The difference is $40 billion and 3,000 kilometers of sovereign reality. Carney did not just answer a question in Oslo, he issued a verdict. The verdict is that the United States is no longer the center of the Arctic gravity. The gravity has moved. It is now distributed among a coalition of the prepared. No buffer, no backup, no plan B. The chokehold is tight. The North is close to bullies, and the switch is in Ottawa. Let us bring in the final auditor. Let us examine the internal ledger of the Canada-China deal through the cold and unyielding lens of capital allocation. If Warren Buffett analyzed this geopolitical transaction, he would not look at the flags, he would not listen to the speeches, he would not care about the political theater of 2026. He would identify a catastrophic failure of risk management in Washington, specifically. He would define this as a mandatory portfolio rebalancing. In the business world, Canada is a company with one primary customer. 75% of every product, every resource, every industrial output flows to a single buyer, the United States, in any other industry. This is defined as terminal concentration risk. It is a massive, growing, and unhedged liability. You are entirely dependent on the solvency and the sanity of a single counterparty. Washington believed this concentration risk was their ultimate leverage. They believed it was a leash. They assumed that because Canada had nowhere else to sell, Canada had no choice but to comply. They treated the relationship as a captured market. They operated under the delusion of a permanent monopsony, a single buyer who dictates the terms to a dependent supplier. Then, Washington became a toxic customer. They threatened the 100% tariff. They weaponized the border. They utilized economic coercion to interfere with the supplier's external business. When your only customer starts attempting to sabotage your other growth opportunities, your fiduciary duty to your shareholders changes. In this case, the shareholders are 38 million Canadians. Mark Carney is the auditor-in-chief. He looked at the ledger. He saw the risk. He executed the national hedge. This is not a political pivot. It is a risk mitigation strategy. When your primary partner becomes a source of volatility, you find a second partner, you create a competing bid, you diversify the revenue stream by signing the deal with Beijing. Carney has effectively reduced the pricing power of the United States. He has lowered the switching cost for the Canadian economy. Washington assumed the switching cost was too high. They believed Canada could not afford to walk away from the American market. They forgot that in a world of high demand for energy and minerals, the supplier holds the ultimate value. Canada is not selling software or fashion. Canada is selling the building blocks of the future. Beef, canola, energy, minerals, these are inelastic inputs. China is a buyer with a massive, growing, and stable appetite for these resources by opening the door to Beijing. Carney has created a global auction for Canadian assets. He has forced Washington to compete for the resources they used to take for granted. This is the definition of a portfolio rebalance. You do not liquidate the American position entirely, you simply reduce the exposure until the risk is manageable. You buy the insurance. Washington acted like a day trader. They prioritize the short-term political win of 100% tariff threat. They chase the headline of being tough on trade. They ignored the long-term structural damage to their own supply chain. They forgot that if you block the front door, your neighbor will simply build a back door. And that back door is now painted Chinese red. The 6% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles is the margin call. It is the physical manifestation of Washington's failure to maintain a monopoly on North American influence. Detroit is now facing a structural breach that they cannot litigate away. They are facing a competitor that is faster, cheaper, and more technologically advanced. A competitor that entered the continent because Washington made the cost of the old partnership too high to bear. Washington tried to short the Canadian sovereignty, and they just received a massive margin call. They attempted to squeeze an ally, and they ended up funding their own strategic rival. This is what happens when you prioritize coercion over cooperation. You lose the account. You lose the leverage. You lose the future. The audit of the North American dynamic is now complete. The results are undeniable. The power has shifted. Look at the reality of Mark Carney in Beijing. No anger, no dramatic speeches, no performance of grievance for the cameras. Just the quiet, lethal execution of a sovereign pivot. He stood in the center of the world's largest emerging trade bloc and calmly rewrote the rules of the continent. The relationship with the United States has moved from a vertical integration to a horizontal competition. The era of Canadian subordination is over. The era of the American veto is finished. Washington can keep its 100% tariff threat. They can keep their bluster. They can keep their social media diplomacy. But they no longer hold the leash. Canada is stepping forward as a trans-Pacific power. They are deploying their resources. They are forging their alliances. They are securing their independence. They are doing it with China. They are doing it with the European Union. They are doing it with the Indo-Pacific. They are doing it with absolute numerical clarity because ultimately, Washington owns the threat, but Ottawa owns the door. The United States will eventually realize the scale of this operational failure. They will see the Chinese vehicles on the streets of Toronto. They will see the Canadian beef in the markets of Shanghai. They will see the American auto industry struggling to compete with a backdoor they cannot close. They will realize that you cannot bully a nation that has already found a more reliable partner. The bypass is operational. The diversification is complete. The concentration risk is being liquidated. Physics doesn't sign treaties. Geography doesn't recognize executive orders. And an auditor doesn't accept a bad deal. The audit is finished. The door is open. The power has moved. This commentary is an independent infrastructural and economic projection based on publicly available strategic data. It does not constitute political endorsement or operational military analysis.